You're probably watching this in the middle of your work week, which I'm guessing is about 40 hours long. 8 hours per day, 5 days per week. This is the schedule that labor activists spent decades fighting for in the 19th and 20th centuries. But its popularity did not last. Today, this schedule is the alleged culprit behind a myriad of physical and mental health problems, especially when, for many, 40 hours really means 45, 50, 55, 60, etc. So how did what is perhaps the greatest labor victory of the 20th century come to be so vilified? And with tests of a shorter work schedule piling up around the world, is it time for a change? Can we keep this modern economy chugging unchained from a 100-year-old schedule? Maybe. Perhaps Iceland could show us the way. It's hard to measure exact working hours, but any way you slice the data, we're working a lot less than we used to, at least in theory. Sorry if unaccounted for overtime plagues your workplace. And that downward trend is no accident. Phase 1 was securing the 8-hour day. The Industrial Revolution broadly replaced laboring on your own farm with working for someone else in conditions that were pretty brutal. 11, 12, 13 hours a day, 6 days a week, in often very dangerous conditions. Like when a mill in Massachusetts collapsed without warning, killing 145 workers and injuring 166 more. And accidents were more likely to happen to overworked, sleep-deprived workers, which most of them were, with employers engaging in such cost-saving tactics as reducing time for meals, drink, and rest, and sometimes even rigging the workplace's official clock. So the earliest labor movements coalesced around a push to cap workdays at 10 hours. But there was basically no success until after the Civil War. This time, the goal was an 8-hour day, and several labor groups rose and fell trying to implement it. They won small victories across the country, but the coup de grace came in the early 20th century. In short, employers needed skilled laborers to run modern factories, just as the supply of skilled laborers started to dwindle. Specifically, skilled European laborers who were a mainstay of American manufacturing by the early 20th century because of the relatively higher wages. First, immigration quotas in the early 1900s limited the supply of European workers. Then, that labor supply dwindled again when the Europeans were busy. So as war rocked Europe, unemployment hit a major low in the United States, which gave workers a lot of bargaining power. Then came part 2, the 5-day week. This came about during the Great Depression. It basically boiled down to a years-long battle with President Roosevelt and Congress on one side, trying to bolster the prospects of working men and women and children, versus employers and the Supreme Court on the other side, trying to prevent what they saw as government overreach. It culminated in the signing of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which, including an amendment 2 years later, set a minimum wage and required overtime for work weeks longer than 40 hours. Oh, and the night before the signing, President Roosevelt said this:
"Do not let any calamity-howling executive with an income of $1,000 a day tell you that a wage of $11 a week is going to have a disastrous effect on all American industry."
But almost as soon as it became standard practice, the 40-hour week started to make less and less sense. For one thing, the type of labor for which this schedule really works, namely manufacturing, where hours generally go hand in hand with output, started to disappear. The share of workers employed in manufacturing peaked at 38% in World War II and plummeted to just 8% by 2019. For the new types of jobs that arose in manufacturing's wake, like mine, a strict adherence to butts in swivel chairs for 40 hours a week isn't necessarily the most effective. And sometimes it can be downright harmful. Given how easy the internet has made it to be constantly accessible, employees often find themselves working far more than the 40 hours they're supposed to. That can lead to all sorts of ill effects: depression, anxiety, and coronary heart disease, to name a few. And the COVID-19 pandemic proved that the economy doesn't crumble when millions of people retreat to their homes and work potentially stranger schedules. So between that and the incredibly tight labor market, we seem to be in a similar situation as our forebears were over 100 years ago, poised to demand fewer hours. So is it time for a change? Lots of people seem to think so. Countries all over the world have instituted, tested, or recently proposed shorter days or weeks, including the US. Last year, a US congressman proposed a 32-hour week bill. Dozens of companies the world over have done the same, including a branch of Microsoft in Japan and, the most famous, the trust company Perpetual Guardian in New Zealand. All of which implies a lot of momentum for the contemporary work less movement. But at risk of sounding like a 19th century robber baron, does it make sense for employees and employers alike?
Everybody wants to work less for the same total pay. Okay? We know that. That ain't gonna happen, okay? It just is simply not going to happen.
This is Professor Hamermesh, who I recruited to basically stop me from getting too excited at the prospect of shorter work weeks going global. And looking more closely at particular examples, he may have a point. Depending on how it's done, switching to a shorter work week can have unintended consequences, like throwing a major wrench in scheduling and operations, as market research firm Alter Agents discovered in the summer of 2020, or the possibility of people simply acclimating to the new work schedule, thus undercutting any productivity gains, as the CEO of Perpetual Guardian likes to say in a lot of interviews. Then there's cost. There's no guarantee that a shorter workweek would be cost-effective, which is what nurses at a retirement home in Gothenburg, Sweden learned the hard way after a 2-year trial of 6-hour shifts with no cut in pay. Which takes me back to a key part of my discussion with Professor Hamermesh. How can governments and employers possibly make new schedules that fit the needs of every single workplace? Like, for what I do, I'm very project-based. As long as I deliver a video script every 2 weeks, who cares how many hours a week it takes me to get that done, you know?
Well, let's be very careful. Your business and my business are somewhat unusual, but there are an awful lot of different unusual ones. What I would like is to have different rules and models in effect depending upon the nature of each of these businesses. That's very hard to do. The question is, what rules do you want? That's the real issue, I think.
I didn't have an answer for this when I first spoke with Professor Hamermesh, but I do now, courtesy of a fascinating trial out of Iceland. Back in 2014, officials in Iceland looked around Scandinavia and discovered that their citizenry worked the most. Yet they also had lower productivity and greater work-related health issues. So, in an attempt to fix both problems in one fell swoop, both the Reykjavik city government and Icelandic federal government ran trials of shorter work weeks. They recruited 2,500 total employees, which is over 1.3% of Iceland's working population. Here's the kicker. Instead of having a really top-down approach where managers or the government tell employees exactly how to cut their work time, each department was left to its own devices. So, for instance, a team in a particular department of the Icelandic government would get together and figure out what works for their team to reduce their hours from 40 to either 35 or 36. And notably, the pay remained the same. In many cases, this was done with just little trims here and there. Shortening or canceling meetings, cutting out unnecessary tasks, delegating necessary tasks more effectively, and cutting those, long coffee breaks that we all love just a little bit. A report released in 2021 found this technique to be extremely effective. Motivated by the carrot of working less, employees maintained or boosted productivity, and reaped some major benefits for health and well-being. And for the contemporary robber barons out there who are concerned about this, the whole project was revenue neutral. Almost. Some industries, such as healthcare, need round-the-clock employees. Doctors and nurses can't just abandon patients because the government said they had to work less. To maintain care, more employees had to be hired, which is estimated to cost the government about $33 million USD annually. However, that number represents only 0.5% of the total Icelandic government budget. Oh, and just so I don't leave you with the wrong impression, Professor Hamermesh is very pro-Americans working less.
In terms of number of hours worked per year, the average American employee works more than anybody in any other rich country. And that was not true 40 years ago. We were right in the middle of the pack. Now we're the workaholic champions.
Everyone, find your favorite badass presidential quote and link it below. Apparently the Library of Congress has a whole archive of FDR's fireside chats, so I know what I'll be doing with my weekend.